This method is how I went from an absolute beginner and totally confused to passing my DELE B2 Spanish proficiency exam with speaking fluency score of 94%, while also transforming my work, my relationships, and even my identity. If you're new here, hola, soy Matthew. I'm passionate about languages and tech. In the past, I used to work for the US-based language learning company Fluent Forever. And I was personally mentored by the famous American polyglot and best-selling author Gabriel Wyner. En este video voy a compartir contigo cómo aprendí el español por mi cuenta hasta lograr fluidez. Let's get into the video. My goal in Spanish was to pass the DELE B2 test and achieve the certificate issued by Instituto Cervantes. And that would give me a sense of clear fluency and a definitive goal that I could certainly reach and aim for. Once I knew my reasons and my goal, I wanted a strategy to get me there. Gabriel Wyner actually released his book, Fluent Forever. A lot of the ideas in that book really just clicked with me. It gave me a plan of action that I could just follow. And Gabe himself spoke a number of foreign languages, so I gave it a try. And here are some of the top language learning tips that I learned from the book. Independent language learning. It is possible for you to learn a language to fluency largely on your own. Research. Base your language learning strategies on solid research. Role models. Learn from others who have successfully learned languages to fluency. Anki, and the importance of memory and spaced repetition. A big part of language learning is actually getting a lot of the language into your head, especially for the large amounts of vocabulary. So being able to know how to do that using Anki and spaced repetition and other tools is going to be very effective for your Spanish journey. Pronunciation. Improving your pronunciation and accent and intonation is really important so that you can build rapport with other Spanish speakers and you can communicate well. Common words. It's useful to focus on the frequently most used words in Spanish at first. No translation. You have to get to a point where you're thinking in Spanish without having to translate in English. And personalization. Language learning can be more effective if you can personalize it and make it more meaningful to you and your life. Then I had finished my original Spanish study plan. I bought the additional resources and videos. I had even done some extra Michelle Thomas beginner and advanced Spanish courses. So I felt, hey, I surely am fluent in Spanish. And so I signed up for the DELE B2 Spanish exam 2 years after starting my Spanish learning journey. A few weeks later, I got an email from Instituto Cervantes, and with anxious anticipation, I opened up the email and it slapped me in the face in big, fat Spanish capital letters or mayúsculas. It said, no apto. And in other words, I failed. My brain melted and it fried for a couple of seconds at least. Wow. I had just spent hours and hours of my life studying Spanish and spent hundreds of dollars, and I had failed. I remember feeling so confident going into that test, but now my whole view of myself and my Spanish speaking abilities just turned upside down. I had done everything that I thought that I needed to do. I followed the plan, but it still didn't work. Burning questions kept running through my head. What went wrong there? Was I really that incompetent? What did I do wrong? How could I improve what I had done? How could I change my strategy? after some deep thought and soul searching, I had to admit to myself that I wasn't fluent. I was probably stuck in a plateau at the lower intermediate levels of A2 or B1. Because I had exhausted all the plans that I had followed before, I got myself back up again and went back to the basics. And one of the foundations really that I knew I had to go back to was research. I pored over the articles, the books, the videos, looking at linguistic research and studies about how to actually reach the B2 level. I also examined other successful language learners who had reached the B2 level. I went deeper into the research and discovered a few things that I really had missed. I concluded that there were 4 key gaps that prevented me from learning Spanish to fluency. 1, I underestimated the amount of Spanish words that I really needed to know. 2, I underestimated the amount of listening practice that I needed and the amount of audio input. 3, I didn't practice speaking enough and I hadn't pushed the limits of my spoken fluency. 4, I needed deeper reasons to keep learning Spanish. So I decided to attack all 4 issues so I could pass the DELE B2. Strategy 1. Increase your Spanish vocabulary. The first thing I needed to do was drastically grow the amount of Spanish words that I knew. When I did the DELE B2 the first time around, I didn't know enough of the words when I was reading or listening, and I had trouble coming up with the right words to express what I really wanted to say. I think that some courses oversimplify and downplay the amount of Spanish words that you really need to know. Some of them say that you only need a couple hundred Spanish words and then you'll be fluent. Spanish learners who reach the B2 level and above actually know thousands of Spanish words. I then set out to learn 5,000 Spanish words proactively. Strategy 2. Increase your listening input. While my reading in Spanish was okay, my listening really was weak, and discovered how important input really was. I recognized that I needed to increase the amount of listening input that I exposed myself to. What I did was I listened a lot for at least 1 hour a day, sometimes even 3 to 5 hours of Spanish audios. And I would listen to news, interviews, podcasts, audiobooks, and even vlogs. And what's great about, as compared to movies or TV shows, is that there's just non-stop talking. So that gives you a lot of listening to put into your brain. Now, there were 2 types of listening techniques that I mainly used. The first was extensive listening. Now, this technique uses a lot of research from comprehensible input, where you listen to just a lot of Spanish language materials, and you're leveraging the research on comprehensible input and acquiring the language subconsciously. When you were growing up, learning your very first native language, you were listening to a lot of audio, and a lot of the time your brain was just picking it all up and soaking it in. Well, that's what you want to do with extensive listening. You want to expose your brain to as much of the spoken language as possible. And that's what I did. And some minor tips for that include slowing down the audio, slow down the speed to 50% of the normal speed or 75%. I even played around with actually increasing the speed, where you speed it up to 25 or 50% above normal speed, so that your brain actually gets used to the language being spoken really fast. And then when Spanish speakers speak at normal speed, your brain's already caught up and is already used to really fast speech. So you won't get thrown off when a Spanish native speaker speaks really fast, because you've already practiced so many times. Now, the second listening technique that I used was intensive listening. Now, this also is a way to hone in your listening, but in a more directed way. What I do is I get short clips of audios or videos of speeches or podcasts or vlogs, and then I get a transcript of that audio. Then I would listen to the audio and then have a read of the text, and I would compare what I could actually hear and what was actually said. And I discovered at first that there were many parts that I just didn't recognize while the speakers were speaking. Over time, I realized that I actually knew a lot of the words, but it was just that my brain hadn't caught up and figured out how to distinguish the words in connected speech. And what I had to do was train my brain to recognize the individual Spanish words and then understand them. And another tip is, as you do extensive listening, you can also create flashcards surrounding certain sentences, words, or pronunciation which you're having trouble with. And that's what I did. I would get certain sentences that contained connected speech that were difficult for me to understand, and then I would create a flashcard with the audio on the front and then the text on the back and test myself to see if I could understand what was being said. If I came across a word that I heard but I didn't know the meaning of, I created a flashcard for that. I would then try to memorize that word. So if I came across that word again in future while listening, I would already know it. And there were also some pronunciation flashcards that I made for any kinds of words or unique pronunciations, such as the Spanish ñ. If I had trouble with it, I would then use that card to memorize how to pronounce that word and hear that word. When it comes to listening, connected speech can be a problem, but another problem can just be that you don't know the meanings of words that are being said. So in cases where I didn't understand the definition of vocabulary while I was listening, I would then go and quickly check the dictionary for any of those words that kept popping up. Now, there were some very difficult words or words that I thought were quite common, and I wanted to memorize them. So for those, I would make an Anki flashcard for those so that I could make sure that I memorized that word for the long term. In the past, Fluent Forever actually had a multi-search word tool where users could type in a word, then they could press a button, and then what would pop up would be the definition, translation, audio, pictures, and other useful information for that word. So if you were listening to Spanish audio or reading a Spanish book and you came across the word recorrer and you didn't understand what it meant, you could then type it in, and then all of that information would be available for you quickly to then make an Anki flashcard so you could memorize that word and understand what it meant. But unfortunately, Fluent Forever discontinued that tool. So if you want that kind of tool to give you instant word info when you're creating flashcards and as you're reading and listening to Spanish material or language materials in other languages, then check out the tool that I've made just for you. And I've made it for free because I use it myself, and I'm sure there are others that would love to use it. Strategy 3, increase your speaking practice, including speaking to yourself and doing speaking fluency exercises. Now, I originally got a speaking score of 39%. That score was one of the biggest pain points that I had. It hurt so much because speaking fluently in a foreign language is one of the hallmarks of success. When I reflected on what went wrong, I thought about the fact that I didn't even know how to speak very basic Spanish phrases. And I made flashcards for them, memorized all of those. I had practiced speaking in Spanish with native speakers in language exchanges and with some paid tutors. But a problem is that each time I spoke to a new Spanish speaker, we ended up talking a lot of the time about the exact same things. Oh, how was the weather? Where are you from? What's your name? I was reaching a speaking plateau because the vocabulary and topics of conversation were always the same. I therefore needed to branch out and get out of my comfort zone and start speaking outside of those regular topics. I would find different topics that asked me to share my opinion, to describe a setting that I was unfamiliar with, and I would record myself and time myself. Then I would try again, timing myself, but this time speak faster and more fluent. I realized that I could automate a lot of this process, so I made myself a fun little tool that timed myself, showed me random topics or pictures, and would help me with my spoken fluency. Now, this tool and this activity really helped because it really helped me from going from a 39% speaking fluency score in the Spanish DELE B2 to a massive 94% score in speaking fluency. So there was a massive jump. So again, check out the free tool that I made and I used to get more fluent in speaking, and I really hope it can help you too. Strategy 4. Integrate Spanish into your life and your identity. After I failed the DELE B2 Spanish test, I was at a crossroads. Do I really want to continue learning Spanish? Do I really need to keep pushing myself to get that B2 DELE test certificate? Why? What was the point? Deep down, I realized that I wanted to keep going because I enjoyed learning Spanish. I loved learning languages, and I loved the people and the culture. I loved the music, the food, and I wanted the Spanish language to be a part of me and my life. And I began to think of myself and view myself not just as a Spanish learner, but I had to be, and I was, a Spanish speaker. And if I was to be a Spanish speaker, then I had to do the thing that a native Spanish speaker would do, and that is to live their life in that language. And I had to think of ways in which I could integrate the Spanish language into my life so that it would be inevitable that I would use the language and speak it to fluency. I had to move away from just short-term tactics of learning Spanish, and I had to think about my long-term identity as an Hispanohablante. One deep connection that I had was regards to my heritage. Dug into the history of my ancestors, my great-grandparents, and discovered that they were Spanish speakers. I started speaking to my kids in Spanish, reading them Spanish books, and teaching them the language because I just loved it so much. And I kept going with enjoying Spanish language. All of this is to say, I don't think the Spanish language became a fad or a whim for me anymore. Al fin y al cabo, mi estrategia fue hacerlo una parte de mi identidad y mi vida. So with these 4 strategies in play, I kept going. I persevered, and eventually, I did it! I passed the DELE B2 Spanish Proficiency exam. I know it's just a certificate, but it was a big milestone and I was so proud. And nowadays, many years after achieving this, I still keep learning Spanish. I'll never be a Spanish native speaker, I admit that, but I can be fluent in a number of various situations, and I can enjoy the Spanish language. And a big part of why I still keep going with the Spanish language and I still love it is because of strategy number 4. I've made the Spanish language a part of who I am.